Thank you all very much for the invitation at today's event. I know a lot of people in this room have worked immensely hard since autumn 2013 on the Educational Review, and it is indeed a tremendous honor to begin the day's discussion, debate, and resolutions. I have titled this talk, Educating Architecture, in part to try and counter the title that was given to me when I accepted the invitation, which was something like Education and Innovation. It's a word I have a medical allergy to, innovation. I think in part for the way it's used in everyday language to try and denote the improvement of everything we know and love already in automatic form. Education and the educating of architecture is the principle that I think our two institutions, alongside many others, share. Interestingly, the word architect is in neither your title as an institution nor my association. We were formed around the culture of architecture and the learning and dissemination of that knowledge, and I think that in some way provides a historical context for considering today's discussion and debate in a slightly different form than the language that's been associated over the last couple of years with the various crises of global economies, the modern profession, service industries, the chaos of Wall Street, the banking industry, in the UK, the crisis of tuition, and all of those things that in the news suggest the need for reform, which are undoubtedly true and important, but I think nowhere nearly as crucial as the reminding of ourselves of how we both came into existence, either as a school or an institute for architects and architecture 160 years ago. This is how we announced our departure from the RIBA almost exactly 100 years ago. As you all know, we shared accommodation together in a building not far from here throughout the 19th century with lots of family squabbles, agreements, and disagreements. As the profession and indeed modern architectural education came into early 20th century form, the first thing the AA did was move into a building and start asking the same questions that you all are asking today, which is how do we educate architects and prepare them for a future we hardly comprehend. I think the caricature of the differences between schools and the profession have hardened into an almost fossilized form by now. I've been waiting many years to be able to bring this poster back to the RIBA. It was produced by a group of students and teachers in the 1970s in Bedford Square at a time in which an intermediate unit launched with the explicit interest in protesting that year's election of a president for the RIBA. A small group called the ARC, the Architects Revolutionary Council, sought above all else to question what the modern profession had become in this country and the role it had played in projects like the planned destruction of Covent Garden, which members of your institute, like my school, played an important part in proposing, and which thankfully lost the battle for. That ARC manifesto was launched in the spring of 1975. This is the Comrades in Action. Presenting to an international television audience through the BBC, and as you can see with a slightly smaller audience at our school, proposing that the profession and schools rethink the role they play in terms of local communities and the projects being proposed in cities like London. I don't really think today's debate is about us versus you. I don't think it's about the AA versus the RIBA. I don't even think it's really about the relationship between education and the profession, so much as it is in how it is we both continue to promote the thing that sits in our original charters, which is the promotion and dissemination of knowledge about architecture. It is a topic, as I say, we think about nearly every day in Bedford Square, and that our students, in fact, have been performing and thinking about for many years. And I think if one image were needed maybe to illustrate the fact that it probably is time for educational reform in this country, this 1958 photograph, taken the year of the Oxford Conference, in which AA students are parodying their precursors from 30 years before in the 1920s, is evidence of the fact that many of the mid-20th century assumptions are probably slightly outdated in terms of the way those students look and think and learn today. I took this photograph with my iPhone on the first day of this academic year in which our students arrived to introduce themselves to the AA school in Bedford Square, reenacting, in fact, that very putting on of a mask that any student goes through in the learning in his or her education. In part, it's also evidence of the fact that it's not schools that make people behave strangely or differently. They come in this way these days. And part of the job of a very good school is to learn from its students and not assume that its job is to teach them things that we already know. The absolutely core principle of architectural education is a student's identity. His or her agenda, project, and ideas exist in the form of the portfolios that they produce. That's why all of you send a very distinguished panel over to our schools every 4 years to look inside those students' minds. How they work is the basis for understanding how it is architecture is learned and communicated in fundamentally new and unexpected ways today that I think not just this institute, but architectural schools themselves need to pay incredible attention to for fear of becoming irrelevant for the way in which those young minds are being formed and will go on to lead your profession. That's the setup. I've really only got 3 points to make in this introduction. The first one is a declaration, the second an acknowledgement, and a third observation, very simple RGB, red, green, blue form to start the day so that we don't get lost. First point, and I think almost paradoxically, in that the immediate context for us thinking about architectural education is its 20th century formation that's kind of rolled automatically into the 21st century. I think the 20th century is absolutely over. I think, ironically, your institute and our association has a huge amount to learn from our 19th century origins. And I want to show you how those origins were parodied by a few AA members. In 1882, the year in which the compulsory examination was introduced by the RIBA, cartoonists at the AA were parodying the imagined relationship suddenly between schools and the profession. And you can see the young graduates of the AA crowding through the front doors of the RIBA, literally passing through the legs of the newly elected president of the RIBA, who was enticing them with sweets. The Sweet Stuff Man was the title of this cartoon, and in a way what that sets up is a kind of imagination for how those two worlds sit in relation to one another and have evolved ever since. What I'd like to remind you of the 19th century is that in fact it was this kind of a mind that gives form to the early years of the association and the principles of the RIBA. As John Ruskin said, as the first ever celebrity visitor to the AA, you could say, in 1853, within a few years of our founding, what this kind of a Victorian moralist, ethicist realized was that in a world of sweeping change, the job of a genuine artist or architect isn't to simply service that world, but to question and interrogate it. And what was forming that idea was this kind of an image of what was sweeping with unparalleled speed across the countryside and the cities of England, which were being converted from places to live in to factories in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. 160 years later, that kind of a project has simply industrialized its presence across our entire planet. And one of the reasons we can derive knowledge and experience from these early years of the RIBA or the AA is because this sort of a reality and the idea that there are certain cities in the world today which are younger in age than their average inhabitants isn't an entirely new phenomenon that we're all trying to negotiate. In fact, this is simply the latest iteration of an industrialization of knowledge, building, construction, learning, which takes sometimes staggering form today and spectacularly reaches into the very studio that we all imagine to be the central space of all architectural life, which we need to question and interrogate with the same set of beliefs and ideas that were brought to bear on similar problems 150 years ago. Second point, an acknowledgement: architecture schools make audiences and not architects. Huge mistake most architectural schools make is to think their job is to produce architects. We do that, but the more interesting figure in this picture isn't that student who hardly anyone in this room is looking at, but rather her audience of fellow students, teachers, and visitors, either within that room or in the early years of the 21st century in a series of overlapping spaces through the streaming, constant broadcasting and dissemination of that conversation to audiences worldwide, which, by the way, is happening in real time, is out of the control of either the individuals in that room or the student presenting in the more traditional form of a tabletop jury. That's one reason why this kind of activity, which I also know you all share here, is so absolutely essential. The forming of a mind in the context of an audience is an absolutely essential part of our core activities. The one demands the other. It's the ability of a mind to negotiate and not only communicate, but to interact with an audience that ultimately allows projects and agendas to live in the world beyond the minds of the people who dream their projects up. To give you an idea of the urgency of that project, look what happens in small lecture halls like ours when the doors are closed. Those audiences literally form on the sidewalk or the street. This is halfway through an afternoon conversation I did with Peter Eisenman a few years ago, in which by the end of the day most of the square was filled up and people were leaning in through windows to try and follow the conversation. Final point, simply an observation that architects, and this is something we all know well, are no longer students only at birth. The formation of the modern profession, like our school, assumed that students were students at the beginning of a lifelong career, and we simply prepared them to go on into that world. That world has been turned fundamentally upside down by the end of the 20th century. As we look at what sits behind the facade of architectural schools today, maybe one of its most interesting features is that 750 student population that Paul mentioned in his introduction includes only about half a student body of people that are entering an RIBA, ARB accredited course. The other half are doing postgraduate work, part-time studies in related fields. Of those, roughly 10% of our students graduate annually with RIBA Part 2. Of those, less than half graduate from our RIBA Part 3 course. Of those, roughly 10 are students at the AA who did Part 2 in Bedford Square before doing Part 3. The world, in terms of education, has changed profoundly from the history of even my own school in Bedford Square over the last 15 years. Tried to come up with an image that would show you where those 10 people might sit in the photograph of an annual graduation event in Bedford Square. They tend to cluster together over on the side for moral support, and everybody is, of course, guessing, as they are in this picture, who gets to be number 10 on that list. Indeed, architects are working in such profoundly different ways today compared to the assumptions of the traditional studio, where architectural models are, for example, of a scale in which structural engineers, planning permission, clients, users are all, in fact, required to even finish an architectural model, that the very assumption that there's a difference between education and professional activities is something we have to construct in order to try and see this sort of picture differently. The other context for that is simply this sort of reality. A school like mine no longer sits in Bedford Square. We have 52 programs worldwide, with more students enrolled overseas than here in London, sitting in places like underneath the motorway of a favela in Sao Paulo. And that population, if added to the diagram I showed you earlier, even further contextualizes the urgency with which we rethink the idea of a professional qualification in a world of rapidly expanding and not only changing architectural knowledge. Roughly 1,500 people added to the 750 in Bedford Square means those 10 individuals qualifying for Part 3 are just about the hardest people to find on the planet within our membership and association. Final point is simply that if we look today at where we're located, we are on the edge of a square kilometer of London which is by 2015 the largest educational precinct in Europe today. Every single working day in Bloomsbury, somewhere between 600 and 700,000 people arrive as teachers, students, researchers, with tens of thousands of audience members like yourselves participating in a global knowledge economy in which education is now the profound driver of capital markets, financial activity, and professional services like architecture in ways never before. The architects we know are escaping the stories that have been written about their origins in this country. They are no longer monks in monasteries. They are indeed the kind of figures that you all have acknowledged in recent years in the Institute. Gold medal winners like Norman Foster, whose plane literally scours the planet in search not just of work, but for worlds that are rebuilding themselves in new and unexpected ways. And I'll just finish with this image, which when I found it, I was astonished because it reads almost like our founding charter at the Architectural Association is in fact yours from the 1830s, in which the point was made, again, well before the arrival of a modern profession, that your central purpose is to promote and facilitate the acquirement of the knowledge of the various arts and sciences connected therewith, referring, of course, to architecture itself. Thank you.